The aftermath of a shell explosion.
A young investigator for the prosecutor's office, dark-haired, curly-headed, and exceedingly attractive to women, a man who didn't just catch glances but captivated them, sat in his office, recently graduated from the legal academy. He was tapping out an indictment on a rickety typewriter concerning a string of basement thefts committed by a gang of juveniles. The investigator cursed under his breath. It must have taken a truly foolish man, or perhaps a staggeringly dim-witted sycophant in Comrade Brezhnev's Politburo, likely some character from the USSR Ministry of Justice or the USSR Prosecutor's Office, who thought in his infinite wisdom that petty crimes and jam-jar thefts committed by minors should be investigated by the prosecutor's office instead of the militia's internal affairs department. But the young investigator in this Estonian SSR urban district did not fully grasp the political situation, for he was not present at the meetings of the CPSU Central Committee Politburo in the Moscow Kremlin. There, the youth question had been under discussion. Brezhnev, clattering his plastic jaws, had spoken to the old men sitting around the circular table, the elite of the Soviet Union's high nomenclatura. How could it be otherwise, comrades? Juveniles are our future, the generation that will build communism, those who will have the happiness of living under it. Youth affairs are of paramount, state-level importance, though, mind you, I think a local militia inspector with a bundle of birch rods tucked into his belt would suffice to keep them in line. But if the comrades of the Politburo feel the prosecutor's office must handle them, well, let them handle them. Brezhnev chuckled to himself, raised a glass of brownish liquid to his lips, took a healthy swig, and continued presiding over the meeting in a livelier tone. Comrades, tomorrow we go hunting. Enough of this bureaucratic nonsense. The state can manage without us old men. Incidentally, Brezhnev's glass always contained a 50-50 mix of tea and whiskey, into which his personal physician would drop a single, invigorating tablet. The district investigator clicked away boredly at his old piece of junk typewriter. He was typing the final lines of the indictment for the basement thefts, dozens of episodes, yawning occasionally. He finally hit the last period, ripped the paper out of the machine with a frustrated yank, and tossed it aside. I'll proofread it tomorrow morning with a clear head, he thought. There was still an hour left in the workday, though it was already getting dark outside, and the bleak, snowless winter day was drawing to a close. The investigator grabbed a copy of the newspaper, Rava Hal, Voice of the People, the central organ of the Communist Party of Estonia, and began listlessly flipping through its pages. The paper told stories of heroic milkmaids, the selfless struggle of the Komsomol for God knows what, and featured the death notice of a high-ranking party official to whom a group of comrades expressed their condolences. But there were also ordinary pieces, so-called lifestyle articles close to the people. One journalist, writing in the spirit of socialist realism, complained that Phillips head screws and Phillips head screwdrivers didn't seem to match. The consumer, the populace, was having difficulty tightening screws. The journalist suggested, or rather demanded, that manufacturers and suppliers pay more attention to fully satisfying the needs of the people building communism, ensuring they had the correct screwdrivers for their screws. Actually, it was a very valid observation, but the investigator snorted disdainfully and glanced at the author's name at the end of the article. He let out a cry of recognition. This journalist was the son of a sector head in the ideology department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Estonia. A decent lad, but he'd been kicked out of Tartu University in his third year for drinking and skipping classes. Now, evidently with his father's help, he'd squeezed himself into the party newspaper as a scribbler, illuminating pain points of society that were smaller than a mosquito bite on a bare backside. On the other hand, such writings were apolitical and safe for the party and government, while simultaneously performing a show of concern for the working class, the intelligentsia, and the kolkhoz peasantry. Tired from the day's work, the investigator continued flipping through the paper. He skipped the death notices, even those where a group of comrades wept for a fallen member of the high nomenclatura. The next story was dedicated to human relations. A female instructor from the district party committee, reputedly a single mother in her late 40s or 50s, wrote that people were being a bit spiteful toward one another, that a certain domestic malice was felt in society, though this, of course, did not diminish the boundless love for the Communist Party and its Central Committee. The instructor described, in a literary style, how she had sat down on the grass in front of an apartment building with her 4-year-old son to rest her legs. But a senior gentleman had emerged from the building, scolded her in front of the child, and chased her away, claiming she was flattening the grass with her backside. Yes, the grass needed protection even from the broad backside of a party official, though the boy surely could have been allowed to run around. The story continued in the same vein, single mothers being harassed. Another horrible experience befell the woman and her child on a train. The child was noisily rolling a toy car on the table, which displeased an older comrade who demanded silence. Yet, 3 minutes later, that same older comrade got off at the next stop. What a misanthropic attitude toward a fellow citizen. But the woman's suffering didn't end there. A third episode was especially dreadful. While walking in a shop with her child, she was berated for getting in the way of an older comrade's shopping basket. In conclusion, the instructor moralized to the reader, teaching socialist norms of behavior and polite treatment of fellow citizens. Of course, the shop shelves were mostly half-empty or entirely bare, which caused depression among Soviet people. But the female instructor remained silent on that. That wasn't a harassing phenomenon. What was harassing was an older comrade bumping her backside with a basket. But let's imagine, the investigator thought playfully, what if that single mother had been bumped by a mid-sized, attractive, tall, broad-shouldered pusher with dark, curly hair and a fine suit? Then there would have been entirely different words, glances, mutual apologies. Perhaps even a date. Harassment is like that. It all depends on who is doing the harassing, how they do it, and what they hope to achieve. Whether the harassment is sustainable, whether one can hope for more, and so on. Undoubtedly, the attractiveness of the harasser is paramount, whether he causes a slight flutter in the woman's, the victim's, or sometimes the male victim's heart. Whether there is potential for a relationship, a life partner, or even marriage, or, if nothing else, at least a romp in bed. But no, some old codger, depressed by the empty shelves, accidentally clips a lady's backside with a basket, and the party official grabs her sharp pen. The investigator tossed the paper onto the desk and said to himself, "Women like that, past their prime and whining about trifles, are more likely suffering from loneliness and a lack of harassment. But in the Soviet Union, there is no sex, no domestic violence, no harassment at home. There are only a few isolated shortcomings and deficiencies that need to be eliminated." The phone rang. It was the duty officer from the District Department of Internal Affairs. "We're sending out the task force, the medical examiner, and the forensic tech. 2 corpses. It's a prosecutor's case. The car will be at the door in a minute." The investigator threw on his jacket, pulled a knit cap over his head, grabbed his folder of document blanks, and hurried toward the door. Then he turned back. The forensic tech at the district office was nothing more than a photographer. He needed to bring the investigation kit himself to take prints and search for evidence at the scene. A UAZ van with militia markings stood outside the prosecutor's office, a blue beacon spinning lazily on the roof. The investigator climbed into the van, where several figures already sat on the benches in the dim light. A middle-aged forensic tech, the photographer, a woman of indeterminate age, the medical examiner, and a younger man in civilian clothes, likely a criminal investigation inspector. The car jolted forward and began to pick up speed, rattling and creaking. The driver clearly knew where to go. The young investigator fidgeted on the bench. This was his first call-out for a double fatality. He was excited, trying to start a conversation, musing aloud. What could have happened? 2 bodies at once. But his companions didn't take the bait. The medical examiner observed the young investigator with an appraising, feminine gaze. The photographer toyed with his brand-new camera. For them, this was nothing new. It was the 100th time or more for the doctor and nearly as many for the tech. 2 or 3 corpses, more or less, didn't matter. The criminal inspector chatted with the driver through the partition. They cracked jokes and roared with laughter. Occasionally, the driver flipped on the siren, just for fun. There was no rush. The dead weren't going anywhere. Soon, the car stopped in central Tallinn, in front of a 5-story building from the Estonian era, pre-Soviet. These apartments were now mainly inhabited by former Russian military officers, now retirees. They mostly lived in pairs, the military pensioner and his old lady, because their children, given the pensioner's status, had been granted apartments in the new high-rises of Lasnamäe. Some descendants, being part of the nomenklatura, even secured flats on Roosikrantsi, Kruksi, or Raua streets. The original inhabitants of these Estonian-era apartments had been taken to Russia in June 1941. The owners were imprisoned and shot in the prison camps of the Kirov region in February or March of 1942, while their deported wives and children disappeared into the Siberian mires. The investigator, clutching his folder and investigation kit, hurried up the stairs to the 2nd floor, skipping steps. Behind him came the medical examiner, who, being of indeterminate age, huffed and puffed as she tried to keep pace. The photographer had shared half a bottle of vodka with a colleague in the office before leaving and was having certain difficulties with the stairs. The young criminal inspector came last, prudently staying behind the medical examiner's broad backside, his hand resting on his unclipped holster. It seemed the group was ready for action, or rather, they had reached a pre-battle mental and physical state. On the 2nd floor landing, neighbors were crowding. Men, women, children, the elderly, and war invalids. They already knew 2 people in the apartment were dead. As for the killer, they could only guess, though they felt they already knew. In any case, 1 floor up in apartment number 6 lived some jerk, the son of a retired KGB colonel, who was constantly drunkenly brawling in the stairwell, promising to shoot everyone, or at least send them to Siberia because his father was a KGB colonel. The residents of the neighboring apartments crowded at the door, but the local militia inspector stood with arms and legs spread wide, trying his best to prevent the masses from storming the apartment. The investigator held his red ID card high. Curiously, the cover didn't say Estonian SSR Prosecutor's Office, but USSR Prosecutor's Office. That was how it was decreed from above, and so it remained. Regardless, the militia inspector immediately snapped his heels together, saluted, and cleared the way. The investigator entered, followed by his entourage. A young man with a knit cap pulled down to his eyes tried to slip in after them, but immediately caught a fist to the jaw from the inspector and was forced to retreat. Writers of detective novels emphasize in their their works, that the criminal always returns to the scene of the crime. That may be so if he happened to leave his passport, driver's license, or a wallet with 10 rubles behind. Chaos reigned in the apartment, as if an artillery shell had exploded and tossed the entire household into disarray. 2 individuals in militia uniforms with large stars on their shoulders, from the city department, were busy at the scene. They were standing by a wall unit, holding a massive gold pocket watch, debating. Is this a gold watch or not? Is it gold or not? It seemed they had a strong urge to pocket the timepiece, sell it later, and drink away the proceeds. As usual. The young investigator, inexperienced, and seeing such a scene for the first time, barked angrily. Please do not touch the evidence. Vacate the scene. The prosecutor's office is taking over the investigation. The men with the big stars muttered something under their breaths and left the apartment, descending the stairs and driving away. Let this greenhorn investigator rot with his corpses. The investigator and the experts began their work. First, visual observation and documentation. The double locks on the apartment door were undamaged and in the open position. The windows in the kitchen and rooms were wide open. A faint smell of gas lingered. In the kitchen, dishes, pots and pans were scattered on the floor. Plates were smashed. The kitchen table was overturned. All the knobs on the gas stove were closed. In the living room, a television lay overturned on the floor. The phone was smashed. The glass in the sideboard was shattered. Trinkets lay on the carpet alongside a broken flower vase and wilted white roses. On a shelf of the wall unit lay a wartime trophy gold watch with a thick gold chain, likely brought back from Germany as war booty. The investigator kept writing the observation report. Meanwhile, the photographer circled the scene, snapping picture after picture. He photographed the gold watch, the overturned TV, the smashed phone. He took close-ups of the shattered vase and the wilted white roses. The investigator finished the preliminary check of the kitchen and living room and entered the bedroom with the photographer, where the medical examiner was already waiting. The doctor began to dictate. 2 lifeless bodies in a wide bed, not covered by a blanket. Male and female, aged 70+. The man, in underwear and an undershirt, lies on his right side. Beside him lies the woman. The woman is wearing a dress and a wool jacket, long stockings and socks. She lies on her back. No external injuries are visible on initial inspection, no bloodstains found. The faces of the deceased are a bluish-red hue, which may indicate carbon monoxide poisoning. The actual cause of death will be determined by autopsy. That is all. The investigator walked around the scene once more, perhaps to recall what he'd learned at the academy. He opened his kit and began searching for fingerprints, but it was more of a displacement activity. Fingerprints were everywhere, and in this utterly trashed apartment, identifying a perpetrator's prints would have been impossible, even if he'd covered every surface with powder and lifting tape. The photographer and the doctor watched the young man's efforts with smirks, but kept their mouths shut. Let him work. He's the lead investigator. The criminal inspector was itching to leave. He had a date with his girl in half an hour. The militia inspector's workday was also over, and he didn't get paid for overtime. But the housing authority plumber stood silently nearby, hoping someone might notice him. Finally, the plumber plucked up his courage and turned to the investigator. "Comrade investigator, I wanted to say, I was the first on the scene. The neighbors called because of the smell of gas. The door wasn't locked. The apartment was full of gas. Every knob on the stove was turned on, even the oven knob. A terrible stench. Luckily, I didn't touch the light switches. I just opened all the windows. Otherwise, it would have exploded. There would have been a hell of a bang." The investigator wrote down the plumber's name and the housing office's number, thanked him, and turned to leave, saying over his shoulder, "If necessary, we'll summon you for questioning." Before heading down, the investigator allowed the morgue workers to enter. They expertly zipped the deceased into bags and carried them away. The investigator sealed the apartment door. Then he spoke with the neighbors. Did anyone know anything? Had they heard a noise, a brawl? The neighbors shrugged and shook their heads. No, it was always quiet, peaceful. The man of the house was a respected war veteran, but that KGB colonel's son from upstairs, that drunkard and brawler in the stairwell, it was him who killed them. Who else? The investigator waved them off. No point arguing with them. People only hear and see what they want to hear and see, and only their own opinion counts. The investigative actions were finished for now, and the militia car dropped the experts and, in passing, the investigator at their homes. The following morning, the investigator sat at his desk, twiddling his thumbs and reflecting. What had happened in that apartment? At the moment, only one thing was clear. 2 corpses. No visible injuries, no blood, but the entire apartment was filled with traces of a horrific struggle that ended in death. A brutally fierce battlefield where a final fight for life and death had taken place. The investigator weighed the theories. First, A third or fourth party entered the apartment for unknown reasons while the owners were sleeping and turned on the gas. A thief, perhaps? But a thief would have gassed himself in the process. And why would a thief need to smash the whole place up? To cover his tracks? Too complex a scenario, and thieves generally aren't stupid enough to kill, gas, and then leave a gold watch sitting on a shelf.
Second theory. The wife was sleeping, the husband was drunk. He turned on the gas in the kitchen and lay down beside his wife. A drunk person can do all sorts of things, not just nasty things, but far worse. But the trashing of the apartment? The wife would have woken up during the commotion and given the drunk husband a solid wallop over the head with a frying pan. That would be perfectly logical behavior for a wife. But it didn't happen. What did happen? The investigator opened his notebook and began drafting an investigative plan. First, identify the circle of relatives of the deceased. Question them about the owners' lives. Then, determine where the deceased worked, if they were still employed, and interview colleagues. Request the necessary records from the polyclinic, the psychiatric dispensary, and the military commissariat. Check for criminal records. That would do for a start. The investigator pulled the desk phone closer and started making calls. Housing Authority, Address Bureau. He gave passwords and connected with the relevant databases at the Ministry of Internal Affairs. He spun the dial over and over, inquiring, researching, arguing, and writing down data. Finally, his page was full. The victim's son worked as the first secretary of the district committee of the party. His wife worked in the Party Education Network library. They had a 10-year-old daughter in the 4th grade. The deceased pensioner was a war veteran. His wife, who died of gas poisoning and was also a pensioner, had continued to work at the party history archives. The investigator mused. A perfectly solid, respectable family. But the event was a fact. The investigator dialed the first secretary's number. An assistant answered, asking who was calling and regarding what matter. An investigator from the district prosecutor's office. I wish to speak with the first secretary personally. It's urgent. The first secretary is in a meeting. Call back later. Write down my number. As soon as he's free, let me know. This concerns him personally. I'll pass it on. The phone was hung up. Half an hour later, the first secretary called personally. First secretary, to whom am I speaking, and what is the question? Investigator from the district prosecutor's office. First, I wish to express my condolences on the death of your parents. In that regard, I wish to ask you some questions. What is there to ask or say? An accident with the gas. The investigator's voice grew sterner and more resolute. I wouldn't jump to conclusions just yet. The law requires an investigation into such an event, and that is what we are doing. Tell me a time when you can receive me. I won't take more than 20 minutes of your time. Fine. Come now. I'm here. Within 10 minutes, the investigator was in the first secretary's anteroom. A pretty girl at the desk was aware of the matter and immediately ushered him into the office. From behind the desk rose a middle-aged man of medium height, well-nourished, and in a fine suit. After a formal handshake, the first secretary offered a seat and said, I am listening. I am listening to you, the investigator replied with a slight smirk. Tell me, please, what were the relations between your mother and father? What was the atmosphere at home? Did your father consume alcohol? How often? And how did he behave? He added, I should note this is not an interrogation but a preliminary conversation. However, I advise you to tell the truth. A shadow of annoyance crossed the secretary's face, but he restrained himself and said, The first secretary of the district party committee is not in the habit of lying. And what do I have to lie about? My parents were elderly people, married for nearly 50 years. My father was a war veteran, decorated with orders and medals. He consumed alcohol very rarely and very little, only on holidays. You know how it is. Veterans have holidays they hold dear. Victory Day, the anniversary of the Great October Revolution, Soviet Army Day. On those occasions, veterans might have a shot or two at home. My mother was a quiet, caring housewife, though she also had a small job in the party archives. The home atmosphere was perfectly normal. They were old people. What else is there? The party secretary went silent and watched the investigator closely. The young man kept a stony face and didn't try to cross-examine him. You don't catch a man like this so easily. The investigator wrote the date and time on the statement and pushed the paper toward the secretary. "Please read it and sign." "What's there to read? I was reading while you were writing." The secretary scrawled a careless signature. The investigator tucked the statement into his folder, rose, and offered his hand. "Thank you. Good day." The secretary returned the handshake. In the anteroom, the investigator smiled at the girl and bid her goodbye. Folder under his arm, the investigator walked toward the prosecutor's office, thinking. It was clear the secretary was sugarcoating the situation. But by how much? Was this a case of covering up a crime or even interfering with the investigation? And for what purpose? He needed to get a statement from the secretary's wife immediately. He picked up his pace toward the party education library. Fortunately, the secretary's wife was at her post. She found a quiet corner in the reading room and the investigator began. First, condolences for the sudden death of her in-laws, then the questions. His questions were exactly the same as those he'd posed to the secretary, and lo and behold, her answers matched the secretary's almost word for word. A truly united couple. They had clearly coordinated their answers by phone. The wife signed the statement and looked at the investigator. Their eyes met. She had beautiful blue eyes, her dark eyebrows slightly accentuated with a pencil. The investigator's gaze slid to her lips, bright red lips, and then, as usual, he didn't fail to notice her bust. A beautiful woman, but a lying devil, he thought as he rose, saying, "We'll likely meet again." He bid her goodbye. She nodded silently. The investigator stepped out onto the street, muttering angrily, "Lying party members. I'll get to the truth." He stopped, lit a cigarette, took a few quick puffs, and decided he would take statements from the mother's colleagues, and then, regardless of those results, from their 10-year-old daughter. A child can't lie effectively, even if she's been coached. The employees at the party history archives, all women, knew their colleague and her husband, the military retiree, had died from a gas leak. The investigator's appearance was no surprise. Let him investigate. It wouldn't bring her back. Yet, they weren't confident as they spoke to him. They looked indignant and miserable, answering his questions with few words. "Did you ever notice anything unusual in your colleague's behavior?" They shrugged and stayed silent. "Did she ever come to work depressed, oppressed, with red eyes from crying, or perhaps with bruises around her eyes?" They shrugged again. One said, "I didn't notice bruises. We all cry sometimes." The investigator gave up, didn't even bother with a formal statement, and hurried to the school to meet the secretary's daughter. The school principal, being part of the district party nomenclatura, immediately dug in his heels. "You may not question a child without the presence and consent of the parents. The law does not permit it. I will not bring the girl to you." The investigator tried to control himself, speaking in a calm but strained voice. "You teach the law to your students. I have already finished my studies. If you do not bring the student to me, I will haul you to the militia lockup for obstructing an investigation, and I will take the girl and a teacher to the prosecutor's office right now." The principal backed down. He led the investigator to an empty classroom, left, and soon a teacher appeared, holding the hand of a beautiful, dark-haired girl. The investigator stood, greeted them, and asked them to sit at a desk. He pulled a chair closer for himself and took a sheet of paper and a pen from his folder. "What is your name, little girl?" he asked gently. "Tanya," the girl answered quietly. "And your first name?" He turned to the teacher. "Oksana."
she replied, as softly as her student. For both, this situation was unfamiliar, even alien.
Tanya, I know an accident happened with your grandfather and grandmother. Accidents happen. None of us are truly protected. What was your grandfather like? How did he talk to you, to grandmother, to your father and mother? How was grandmother's life? Tell me. I really need to know.
The girl covered her face with her small hands and burst into tears, speaking through sobs.
He was a very good grandfather. Very good. And grandmother was so good, so sweet. She spoiled me with sweets and always gave me gifts for New Year's and my birthday. But grandfather was in the war. He was shell-shocked by an explosion in Berlin, and when he drank a bottle of vodka on his pension day, he became very sick, very sick. And now grandmother is gone too.
The girl burst into heartbreaking sobs.
And no one helped her. No one. Grandmother couldn't help, and I couldn't either.
The investigator placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. You are a brave girl. You wanted to help them, but you couldn't. You're still too small for that. But you aren't alone. You have a loving father and mother. The girl stopped sobbing, took her hands from her eyes, and looked at him with a tearful but happy face.
Yes, but I'm not alone. I also have a sweet little brother.
The investigator was momentarily confused. He had no record of a brother. Perhaps this brother could provide valuable testimony. Children lie like children, but not like adults. He collected himself and asked, as if in passing, "You have a brother? That's wonderful. How old is he? Older than you?"
He's 2 years old.
Ah, I see, the investigator said, disappointed. Quite small, but he'll grow. He'll be so much fun to play with.
He's still too small for playing, and he can't even talk yet, though he knows a few words.
He'll learn. He'll learn to talk, walk, and play. Thank you, Tanya. I believe everything will go well for you. He pushed the statement toward the teacher, who signed it without a word. Thank you, Oksana, he said, signaling that they could leave. The teacher rose, took the girl's hand, and turned to go. After a few steps, she turned her head and looked at the young investigator, as if waiting for something. Perhaps an invitation to a date? But the investigator was occupied with other emotions and instincts. The flirting didn't register. He nodded goodbye to the pretty teacher and looked back at the statement. He mused over the girl's words. Grandfather was shell-shocked in the war. When he drank a bottle of vodka on pension day, he got sick. But otherwise he was a very good grandfather. And now grandmother is gone, and no one helped her. His gaze slid across the classroom. The anniversary of the Soviet Army was approaching, and the walls were decorated with pictures of the war. Tanks charging into battle, artillery firing, shell explosions, infantry on the attack, the flag being raised over the Reichstag in Berlin. He sighed. The Second World War is still going on. It's continuing here in the classroom and in the homes. Back in his office, the investigator wrote the third version of his investigation plan. The pensioner, shell-shocked in the war, drank a bottle of vodka on pension day. It made him sick. That is, it drove him mad. He brawled in a frenzy, trashed the house, then collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep. This happened year after year, throughout the entire post-war era. Finally, the wife couldn't take it anymore. She turned on the gas and lay down on the bed beside her husband. The investigator snorted with satisfaction, logical and consistent with the facts. Then he suddenly shuddered. In that case, we're looking at a murder and a suicide at once. Holy heaven. The woman gassed her husband and killed herself as well. A completely believable version, but such things aren't done on a whim. Therefore, the tragedy had a longer, sadder, and mentally more horrific backstory. He had to open a criminal case to clarify the circumstances, the enablers, those who covered up the traces, the failure to provide aid to a severely ill man, the neglect of a woman suffering in terrible spiritual agony.
The investigator initiated the criminal case using the harshest paragraph of the criminal code, intentional homicide. Starting the next workday, he made his first call to the party secretary. "Comrade Secretary, we need to clarify some circumstances in the case we know." The secretary didn't dodge. "My first event is at 10. Come now."
The secretary offered coffee. The offer was welcome, as the investigator was a bachelor and often skipped morning coffee at home. They sat and drank in silence. The secretary didn't speak first. The investigator set his cup down and spoke calmly, almost indifferently. "I have opened a criminal case for murder in this matter." The secretary's hand froze with the cup near his mouth. He flinched at the word. "What murder? What are you talking about? It was an accident." "Your father fell asleep drunk. Your mother opened all the gas knobs on the stove and lay down beside him. In doing so, she committed the murder of her husband and her own suicide." "That's impossible. They were married for so long. They were old people, and suddenly—" The investigator raised his voice. "No, it didn't happen suddenly. Your mother reached this point through years, decades of suffering, heartache, and despair. I know what was happening in that apartment, but I must take your statement. A statement in a criminal case."
The investigator filled out the header of the interrogation protocol, entered the secretary's details, and said, "I am interrogating you in this matter. You may refuse to give testimony that incriminates your relatives, but lying is a criminal offense. Sign here to confirm you've been warned." The secretary signed in silence. The investigator continued, "I won't take much of your time. Only one question is vital for the investigation. Did you know what was happening in your parents' apartment over the years? Tell me what happened, and don't dodge. I know it even without you, but I must record your testimony." The secretary fidgeted, coughed, shrugged, and said, "Father was shell-shocked in the war. When he drank a bottle of vodka on pension day, the illness flared up violently, and he would go on a rampage. Mother suffered greatly because of it." The investigator nodded. "I could end the interrogation there, but I must also identify the circumstances contributing to the crime. Why did you do nothing? Why did you leave your father and mother without help?" The secretary replied quite bluntly, "Was I supposed to stick him in the madhouse?" The investigator snapped. "Not stick him in the madhouse. There is outpatient and inpatient specialist care." "Well, yes, but the people would find out that the district secretary put his father in the madhouse. They might think the secretary himself is mad, genetically mad." A shadow of a smirk crossed the investigator's face, but he checked himself. "So, you cared more for your career than for the lives and health of your mother and father?" The secretary stayed silent, sipped his coffee, and asked hesitantly, "What will happen to the criminal case, and to me?" "Nothing will happen to the case. It will be closed. One could argue incitement to suicide, but the inciter, your father, is dead. One could speak of the mother's self-defense or exceeding the limits of self-defense, but she poisoned a sleeping, defenseless man. It's all just legal hair-splitting. The parties involved are dead. The question of guilt or innocence no longer matters for the investigation." "But what happens to me?" the secretary asked anxiously. "Everything that happened has already happened. But the question of guilt and innocence will haunt you for the rest of your life." The investigator took the secretary's signature and left without saying goodbye. Such a man, who saw only his own career, filled him with gloom. On the steps of the party building, the investigator stopped, pulled out his cigarettes, and lit one. He mused to himself. Everything was clear, but the file needed more material. Otherwise, those jerks, the prosecutors in the oversight department of the Estonian SSR prosecutor's office, would start whining that the investigation was too superficial.
He had to go and question the careerist secretary's wife.
As he walked, the face of the woman he'd seen before rose in his mind, her figure, her voice, her whole being. He had studied at the Moscow Juridical Academy for 5 years and had come to know Russian women well. They were beautiful, undemanding, caring, and sexually insatiable. With some seventh sense, some masculine instinct, the young investigator felt that the secretary's wife was exactly like that. This time, the woman who received him was slightly different. Her lips weren't painted. Her eyebrows and eyes weren't outlined. Before him stood a beautiful, undemanding, caring, grief-stricken Russian woman. "Coffee?" she asked caringly. "Thank you. Your husband just offered," he said, and continued immediately. "Let's sit. Tell me everything you have on your heart regarding this event. If necessary, I'll ask clarifying questions. I must warn you, tell only the truth, and if you wish to leave something unsaid, leave it unsaid." The woman began to speak in a quiet voice. "My father-in-law was shell-shocked in the war. He was very ill. He shouldn't have touched alcohol at all. When intoxicated, he completely lost it and went on a rampage. His wife, my mother-in-law, suffered for years, for decades. It was all so terribly hard for her and for me. I begged my husband to put his father in treatment, but he refused. His career was everything to him. He was afraid people would think ill of him, that he too was mad, hereditarily mad." She fell silent and wiped a tear. "I wanted to do something, but he wouldn't let me." "Did your mother-in-law's colleagues know about the situation at home? She was still working." "They knew. They called me, told me she came to work in tears, depressed, sometimes with visible bruises. They begged for something to be done, but my husband wouldn't allow us to interfere. Even the militia came several times, but everything was just left as it was." The woman wiped her eyes with a handkerchief and looked at the investigator. Her eyes were so enchantingly deep and beautiful that his heart skipped a beat. He felt embarrassed. It seemed to him that he had suddenly, like a schoolboy, fallen in love with this simple, beautiful Russian woman. He took her signature on the protocol but remained seated. She didn't move or say a word, just watched him. Finally, the investigator rose, tucked the protocol into his folder, placed his palm on hers, squeezed it gently, and left. He stepped out onto the street, fumbled in his pocket for cigarettes, and sighed deeply. Damn it, those Russian women are always maddeningly sexual. They were in Moscow, and they are here in Tallinn. But this case is closed, the crime discovered, except for the true culprit, for the one who hushed up a tragedy, who left a sick person without aid and thus passively abetted a crime, for the cover-up and the facilitation of it all. For him, they haven't yet invented a paragraph in the criminal code of the Estonian SSR. Thank you for listening. To discover more stories, follow the link in the description below.